Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Colgate Room. My name is Chris Lyons, and I have the proud distinction of being the head of Rare Books and Special Collections. This is a roar event, and undoubtedly a roaring event. That will be the first bad joke of the evening, perhaps, and if you're really lucky, the last. ROAR stands for an amalgam of Rare Books, Osler, there's an Osler Library of the History of Medicine, Archives, and Art, because these are the four special collection units that collectively make up the identity of ROAR. And we have had the great fortune to be able to co-sponsor a number of events or sponsor a number of events which allow us to bring some of our wonderful collections and wonderful people who work with our collections to a broader public. So I'm very pleased to see you here today. And now I'm going to invite Professor Faith Wallace to come up and start the occasion.
It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. It's customary to begin introductions by claiming that the speaker needs no introduction. But actually, I think Lorenz Lüthi needs, as well as deserves one, because even his colleagues may not be aware of his rather remarkable trajectory. Lorenz was born and raised in Switzerland, where he was early on infected with three of the passions that continue to dominate his life: chocolate, alpine skiing, and trains. After receiving his licentiate, which is a sort of combined BA and MA from the University of Zurich in History, Political Science, and International Law, Lorenz decamped to the United States and received his MA, his MPhil, and PhD in History from Yale University. The year he completed his doctorate, he joined the Department of History here at McGill as professor in the History of International Relations. Now, the international relations that most preoccupy Professor Lüthi are those that constituted what we call the Cold War. Run-of-the-mill Cold War history frames it as a kind of binary struggle between the USSR on one side and the USA on the other, maybe spiced up with some proxy conflicts in Africa or a nod towards the non-aligned nations movement. Instead, Lorenz Lüthi reimagines the Cold War as a kind of international political ecosystem containing a high level of species diversity in the midst of fluctuations of climate change. His first book, The Sino-Soviet Split, 1956 to 1966, Cold War in the Communist World, published by Princeton University Press, won 2 prizes, the Furness and the Marshall Schulman Book Awards. He has edited 2 volumes on regional dimensions of the Cold War in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and is the author of numerous articles and book chapters on China, the Soviet Union, the Vietnam War, and Cold War Europe. He's in the process of completing his second monograph, A History of the Cold War Beyond the Superpowers, East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, which will synthesize his decades of research in European, Asian, North American, and Australian archives, much of it supported by major grants from SSHRC and other agencies. Lorenz Lüthi has received numerous academic honors, a National Security Fellowship at the Olin Center for Strategic Studies in Harvard, a stint at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, visiting fellowships in Shanghai, at the London School of Economics, the Freie Universität Berlin, and the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Since 2015, he's been a member and head of the research group at McGill's Jan Lin Center for Freedom and Global Orders. But the award he's proudest of, or at least the latest award that he seems to be most proudest of, is his diploma in Arabic from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which he earned in 2016, thanks to a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship. Arabic now joins Russian, Chinese, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian, Polish, French, and English as languages Lorenz can speak and or read. But Switzerland is a country which has 4 official languages, so maybe that's just another cultural trait that he was infected with very early on. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Lorenz Lüthi.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and it's really now hard to live up to the expectations. So, good evening, and let me thank ROAR for organizing actually this lecture. I am the resident historian of international relations, and before I start with my lecture, I would like to point out the exhibit outside, and I think Laurie will talk about this a little bit later. But it's an amazing exhibit from archival holdings from McGill about the time of the Vietnam War and its relationship to McGill. So when you file out after this lecture, there is this glass case on the left side. It is really quite amazing. When I saw the selection of documents that McGill has, I was really quite surprised. So, we talk today about the Tet Offensive. It's pretty much 50 years now that the Tet Offensive started on January 30th, 31st, 1968. At the time when American students fled the United States and came here to study, the so-called draft dodgers. And out of curiosity, you don't have to identify yourself, but I would just like to know who actually is here and is a draft dodger. Oh, I'm actually surprised. I expected actually to have at least 10. All right. So, this was a very controversial time, of course. The late 1960s, the time around actually the Tet Offensive, not only here at McGill, not only in Canada, not only in the United States, not only in Europe. And the controversies continue until today among historians of the Vietnam War, of the Cold War, or of just Vietnam. Particularly in the United States, where historians are still fighting about the interpretation of the Vietnam War, and particularly the Tet Offensive. Usually these debates among historians in the United States boil down to one question: whether or not the American participation in the war in Indochina was honorable or was criminal. So to be a little bit brash about this. Now I understand why this debate follows these lines, given the level of domestic conflict the United States experienced in the late 1960s. And not all of this conflict was related to the Vietnam War. This conflict had other roots, but the Vietnam War was the one issue that really unified all these protest movements, be it student, be it women, be it actually ethnic minorities. Now, the problem was and still is that this debate, largely fought among historians in the United States, is in fact unrelated to the question what really happened in China on the ground. Some of the participants in this debate use Vietnam as a screen on which they can project their arguments. Many are making just a priori judgments about the Vietnamese side. The Vietnamese communists were Soviet puppets, allies of the Chinese communists, they were just nationalists, or they were anti-colonialists. And with that, the discussion sort of is over. Now, what I try to do in the next 20 or 25 minutes is to unpack this black box. I want to look at this Tet Offensive from the other side, from the communist side. What's the meaning of that offensive to them, and how does it fit into a larger development of actually Vietnamese history? I have, however, to confess that I do not speak Vietnamese. So when I rely on some of the research, this is research I have not done. The colleagues have done this research, and colleagues who speak Vietnamese. However, I have done a lot of research on the topic in Chinese, Russian, Polish, and other archives. And they're very revealing, because all of these allies, socialist allies of North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam at the time, they are in constant consultation and conversation with, in fact, the North Vietnamese. And many of these documents are now available. Still, this is a puzzle of many pieces, and many pieces are actually missing to this very day. So, let me start with the Tet Offensive. What was it? This is actually South Vietnam, or officially the Republic of Vietnam. It started on January 30th and went on more than beyond January 31st. It was in fact a combined attack by insurgents of the National Liberation Front, or we usually refer to them as the Viet Cong, and regular members of the People's Army of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese army, who had infiltrated South Vietnam in the preceding months. It aimed at a multitude of targets in the Republic of Vietnam, including American troops and institutions, like the American embassy in Saigon. And Saigon is down here. This is Saigon. Virtually all of these attacks failed within 24 hours. Only the imperial capital Hue, up here, framed in red, could be held by actually communist troops for roughly a month. During the fight to retake it, South Vietnamese and American troops reduced the city, including the famous imperial palace, to rubble. Yet Hue was not the only southern city destroyed during the Tet Offensive. A significant number of smaller cities and villages suffered the same fate. A US major justified the enormous level of destruction of the capital of Ben Tre province, which is up here, roughly. He justified the destruction of the capital of Ben Tre province with the often quoted and often misquoted words, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it." And this leads me now to the second point of the talk. Why did the Vietnamese communists start this offensive in the first place? I could go back to 1967 and I could just talk about how the North Vietnamese leadership actually decided to launch this offensive. But this is a little bit easy because it really excludes the long background history, and this is the history I would like to explore. I want to go back actually to the 1920s and 1930s and then sort of walk you through actually the different stages of development as this conflict comes about. And the 1920s and 30s is of course the period of French colonial occupation of all of Indochina. This is how Indochina looked like under French colonial occupation. There were 5 parts. Vietnam emerges in the merger of Cochin China, Amman, and Tonkin. Now, French-occupied Vietnam at that time experienced a very lively debate among public intellectuals about the post-colonial future of the country. What would this country be? Would it be a monarchy? Would it be a republic? Would it be something else? What would be its territorial extent? Today's Vietnam, all of Indochina, even additional territory in Thailand. What would be its name? Vietnam, Dai Viet. There are numerous actually examples or variations. The point here is that this is a country that was still in national formation. And I argue in a book which I'm writing at the moment on the Cold War that this is a debate that is not really concluded until the late 1970s in the case of Vietnam. Now, the communists were not major participants in this debate. They were onlookers, and to a certain degree they were touched by it. It is very clear that they knew about these debates, and these debates would continue among them into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The question is really, what is Vietnam in terms of territorial extent? And as I said, this really ends only by, I think, 79, 80. This debate about the extent of the territory was imposed onto them by the Comintern, which is the Soviet organization established in 1919 to basically promote world revolution outside of the emerging Soviet Union. There's no doubt that Ho Chi Minh was actually a Comintern agent. He was the man charged with establishing the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930, but he decided to call it the Vietnamese Communist Party. Under pressure of the Comintern, he had to change the name back to Indo-Chinese Communist Party within half a year. And really what you have here is, you have actually this debate about what the post-colonial state is, really at the very beginning of that party. It's already there. And it's not unusual. It's a debate that is of course reflected actually among non-communists as well. Now, the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, remained a very small actually outfit. I would say actually an insignificant party in the 1930s, largely because the French security services in Indochina and the British security services in Hong Kong, where the ICP was in fact established, were very good at keeping their fingers on members. So, in fact, there is a huge turnover of membership. Many get arrested, many just become members and then drop out. So there's not really a stable base. There is a stable core of cadres at the top. Now, during World War II, French Indochina, of course, was occupied by Imperial China. And in March 1945, Japan abolished the French colonial administration. It ruled through the French colonial administration in Indochina. So it did not, when it occupied Indochina in the course of the war, it did not abolish actually this administration. It ruled through it. But in March 1945, as Japan was about to lose the war, it decided to abolish the French colonial administration to prevent the French from returning as colonial power to actually Indochina. That was the idea. It was in this context of the coup in March that, in fact, 3 states emerged under Japanese, actually, what would you call that, tutelage or leadership. And this is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Actually, these 3 parts get actually unified. These are not really sovereign states. There's very conditional sovereignty. The Japanese still try actually to control developments. However, the Japanese surrender, of course, in August. Now, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, President Roosevelt had proposed to put Indochina under a trusteeship because he believed its peoples were not yet ready for independence. And this is essentially what he also proposes for Korea. And so many of the problems that emerge in Korea, including the Korean War, go back to this idea of tutelage. In the first step, Indochina was simply divided for military occupation by the Chinese from the north. This is, I forgot to show you, this is of course Ho Chi Minh. And here we see China was supposed, actually, the Chinese nationalists were supposed to occupy from the north and the British from the south to the 17th parallel. The French were nowhere in the picture. The idea here is also to exclude the French return. Roosevelt did not want the French to return either. Now, at the end of the war, in August 1945, the ACP was able to seize power in the north, and they established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd. No other country except actually Cambodia recognizes actually this new state. So it's not recognized by anybody, virtually. Anyway, the ICP had a shortage of cadres. They had around 5,000. And so it was very hard for this Communist Party to establish a presence in all of Vietnam. Anyway, when the Chinese troops arrive, they are not very sympathetic to the communists. They are from the nationalist government. They, in fact, decide to work with the Vietnamese non-communists, with the non-communist nationalists. At the same time, de Gaulle's France convinces actually the United Kingdom that they don't really have a real interest in the southern part of Indochina, and they more or less replace, within a very short period of time, the British occupation troops. So France emerges back as a colonial power by the end of 1945. When the Chinese withdraw in 1946 because they need these troops in their own civil war against the Chinese communists in Manchuria, the French are going to actually move north. The DRV has to leave the cities, control in the south starts to collapse, and is increasingly pushed to actually into the mountains to the north and here into this border area with Laos. And there are some actually, what do you call the resistance areas, insurgent areas here in the south. So this is the setup. It doesn't look good for the DRV late in 1949. But then the People's Republic of China is actually established, and starts to intervene and starts to support actually the Vietnamese communists. This leads to a long drawn out war between the Vietnamese communists and the French that has no resolution. Eventually the two agree actually at the Geneva Conference on a peace agreement. And here for the first time, and I show this on the next clip, for the first time the Democratic Republic of Vietnam gets a territory that is internationally recognized, not by everybody, but by actually at least the French, the Soviet Union, China, and the United Kingdom. So for the first time, it is actually a state with an established territory. The state of Vietnam, soon to be renamed the Republic of Vietnam, emerges out of the colonial empire of the French, as the French withdraw in 54 and 55. Now, both Vietnams, as they now emerge, are not particularly well-run states in the mid-1950s. In the north, the DRV tries to build up a socialist society, and it leads to major economic problems. And this attempt to build up a socialist society has to be scaled back very quickly. The south was also internally divided between various political movements, and you could say really it experiences a civil war for leadership in the south. The man who emerges as the strong man is this man, Ngo Dinh Diem, who has not a very good image among many historians, and also among the Vietnamese to this day, I think. But I would like to think about him in a different way. I want just to make it clear where I stand. This is a very flawed leader. There's no doubt about that. But he was not an American puppet. I think we really have to abandon this idea. There's a lot of new research being done on him, and the reality is that he comes from a non-communist nationalist family with roots that go back to the 1920s. His family suffered under the persecution by communists. His brother was actually executed by the communists in the late summer of 1945. So it's not surprising that he, as a nationalist, has a different vision of the future, and it does not share the vision of Vietnam as a communist state. Now, the lines of the civil war in the South are not necessarily lines. The South is not divided necessarily between communists and non-communists. It's mostly divided between non-communists. They are actually fighting for predominance there. I have to say at this point, as the Geneva agreements are actually coming to force, the DRV has to withdraw the insurgents from the south. A large number of insurgents and cadres moved to the north. I think it's almost 100,000. However, in violation of the agreements, around 10,000 guerrilla fighters are not withdrawn, and they are actually ordered to lay low for a future insurgency. So North Vietnam is in violation of the agreements very early on. Now, Diem is not only able to become essentially the strongman in this in the emerging Republic of Vietnam, he's actually also slowly starting to go after communist insurgents and cadres in the south. And this is, I just want to mention this here because this is important to understand why this is how this relates to the Tet Offensive. In the north, the failed attempt to build socialism leads to a new leadership, and this man emerges, Le Duan. Le Duan becomes the temporary leader in 1957 and becomes the general secretary officially in 1960. He was neither affiliated with the Comintern, nor was he particularly pro-Chinese. He was a founding member of the ICP in 1930, but in the 15 years until the end of World War II, he spent around 10 years in a colonial prison, in a French prison. So he belongs to a generation or to a group of Vietnamese revolutionaries who went through that colonial prison experience, and they considered actually this experience their university. And they come out really convinced, that they have to get rid of French colonialism. These are really hardened actually revolutionaries, unlike Ho Chi Minh, who certainly had risked his life, but has a very different life experience. He ran the insurgency in the south from 1945 to 1954. he actually did not agree that in 1954 at the Geneva Conference, Vietnam should be divided. He opposed this, but he explained it actually to the cadres. He basically submitted to the decision of the leadership to agree to division, but he personally did not agree with it. He also had to convince the southern cadres to withdraw, which was very hard for him. Why he was chosen to succeed the old General Secretary, and that's Trong Chinh, it's not Ho Chi Minh, it's Trong Chinh, is not completely known. However, it is quite clear where he stood in the internal conflict about the future strategy. There was one faction that advocated focusing on constructing socialism in North Vietnam first, and once this is firmly established, then one can think about actually unification. To simplify, this is the faction of Ho Chi Minh. There's the other faction, that's Le Duan's faction. This is the one that actually wants to reunify first. Let's pursue through military struggle reunification, and then think about creating a socialist state. I would argue, and I have done this in a draft chapter, that he was not only the leader of this militant faction, but that he is in fact an Indo-Chinese nationalist. Whereas Ho Chi Minh is a Vietnamese patriot who wants to reunify Vietnam in the long term, Le Duan is actually committed to reunifying Indochina under Vietnamese leadership. And he probably was also a world revolutionary who wanted to export the actual revolution into Southeast Asia. I have him on record in the 70s where he says we now go for Thailand and the Philippines and Malaysia. So this is a very different type of leader now. He is actually traveling to South Vietnam in disguise in 1958 to check the situation on the ground. And when he returns, he basically reports to the leadership in Hanoi. What he had seen in the South, he did not like. It looked to him, or so he claimed, that in fact Diem was consolidating power, was arresting, was decimating the insurgents, who were still laying low. And some of the insurgents were also leaving the movement due to actual demonization. It looked to him, or so he claimed in his report, that the window for unification was closing in the South. That Le Duan concluded that South Vietnam was stable is somewhat surprising if you look back on South Vietnam as a historian. Diem was originally from northern Annam. His hometown ended up in the southern DRV. When you go back here, so he's from this region, roughly. He is a Catholic in a largely Buddhist society in the south. Personally, he probably wasn't corrupt, but he allowed his family to get into positions of political and economic power, which they used to enrich themselves. His clan or his family was not very popular in the south, and he was, as I said before, a flawed leader. He had an idea of reforms in the south that did not work out. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam is not really stable. It's an unstable society, and it's not only unstable because of the increasing insurgency as it has now been ordered in Hanoi. By 1963, the United States was deeply frustrated with this ally, tried to push this ally to reform, and I don't think so that the American proposals were completely nonsensical. I think the Americans had good ideas, but he basically doesn't want to appear as an American puppet, so keeps the Americans at arm's length, but of course takes all the money. So eventually his generals decide to overthrow him on November 1st, and then he and his corrupt brother are killed the next day. 3 weeks later, Kennedy is assassinated, but for unrelated reasons. But this is sort of, there's a closeness of events. Now, looking south from Hanoi, Le Duan in late 1963 saw a very different Republic of Vietnam, a state that was not in control, one that seemed to be collapsing, and it was at this point that the DRV orders actually the insurgency, the National Liberation Front, which it had established, to rise in the hope that the military insurgency would spark a popular uprising against the regime. And this is Marxist-Leninist standard actually theory. You use a military intervention and you hope that people rise up. This is what Stalin tried to do when he was sent to go into Poland after the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was stopped by the Poles. This is what Kim Il-sung is doing in 1950 when he attacks South Korea. Military advance and then a popular uprising, and then the other regime topples. Of course, this is not happening, neither in Poland, nor in Korea, nor actually in the early 60s in South Vietnam. In fact, the American decides to intervene. And there's a whole range of reasons why they intervene, but this is one, that they see this insurgency rising. Now, when we are now in 1964, 1965, and we now look forward into the future, to 1968, you now see what actually the Tet Offensive is. It's essentially the second attempt of a general offensive by insurgents designed to basically trigger an uprising in South Vietnam. That's the idea. It's again a disaster, and in 1972 they try again, and it's again a disaster. And only in 1975, when it's a conventional military campaign and the South Vietnamese state is so brittle internally, then only then the North Vietnamese can actually take over. The decision to launch this Tet Offensive, and I have the time in view, so just to be clear about this, the decision was actually made in the second half of 1967. It was preceded by internal purges of Le Duan's opponents, including supporters of Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh was sort of also lost de facto power, and attempts by Le Duan to establish a police state to secure his sole leadership. So I often refer to him also as a kind of a Stalinist. He had the same urges of total control. The decision to launch this offensive was taken by Hanoi alone. There's no input by Moscow or by Beijing. Both the Soviet Union and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, were very critical about this offensive, but nevertheless actually provided all the weapons that enabled this offensive actually at least to succeed in the first hours and days. The Tet Offensive was a military disaster. What is happening is that there is this major offensive in late January into February that is repulsed, and then there are two follow-up actually offensives, and none of them actually succeeds. In fact, the Americans and the South Vietnamese and the Australian troops who are there, they are very good at suppressing this insurgency and essentially rooting out the insurgents. They create essentially a South Vietnam that is almost free of insurgents. And this is why it takes 4 years for the DRV to build up these networks until 1972. It is really the low point of the insurgency in the South. However, it has one unintended consequence. It does actually erode political support in the United States. Johnson decides not to run for a second full term and essentially now dedicate the remainder of his time to try to find a negotiated solution. Now, my talk carries the title, The Tragedy of the Tet Offensive. And this is, of course, a little bit also due to that we needed a kind of an attractive title for tonight. But I want to talk also about actually the tragedy. Now, the overall tragedy is that by really mid-1968, it is clear that neither side can win this war. And it still takes another 5 years for this war to end. And the largest number of people die actually in this 5 years. The largest number of Vietnamese, more than 3 million Vietnamese die. And the largest number of Americans, I think that's 58,000, if I remember correctly. The other tragedy is, and now look at it from the North Vietnamese side, is that Le Duan did not change his general approach to the war. I'm not a big fan of President Nixon, to be absolutely clear about that. But he is the president who decides actually to withdraw. And slowly, and he escalates in order to cover actually his withdrawal. That's the reason why he escalates. By 1971, Washington offers a peace treaty to Hanoi. And this is essentially the peace treaty the two will sign in January 1973. There are some minor, actually, things. His ultimate goal, so there's to a certain degree, you have the potential to, the possibility to end this war by March, April 1971, and it still takes another 22 months for it to end. Why did Le Duan not take this? His ultimate goal was not US withdrawal from Vietnam, that was the offer. But what he wanted is he wanted complete Vietnamese military victory over the United States. A victory that would humiliate the United States at the global level and inspire anti-imperialist revolutions throughout the Afro-Asian world, and maybe even in Latin America. He got the same treaty in 1973, after much bloodshed, and I think both the Americans and Le Duan and his leadership are co-complicit for the suffering, at least for the final 2 years of the Vietnamese War. And this leads me to some final reflections about the American participation in the Vietnam War. This goes back to this discussion among the American public and among American historians, was actually the American intervention in Vietnam War justified or not justified? If you had asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have had a very clear answer. It was unjustified. The decision to escalate, to intervene in the early 1960s, I would have said was a mistake, it was a gross error in judgment. To be fair, I'm not quite sure if I could give you the same answer now, and this might surprise you. Now, let me be clear, the Americans knew in 1964, 1965 that this is not a winnable war. When they escalate, they know it's not winnable. And I'm always stunned when in my Vietnam seminar, I have some students here who take currently my Vietnam War seminar, and I have taught this now 4 or 5 times. Whenever we reach that point, the students throw their arms in the air and say, how could they? And it's so clear that they know that it's not winnable, right? But keep in mind, victory over North Vietnam was not the goal. The goal was to defend South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese takeover. The North Vietnamese wanted to topple the Southern regime. The Americans never planned to topple the North Vietnamese regime. It was about defense, it was about containment. Anyway, the Americans knew, because the Chinese had sent very clear hints in the summer of '65, if they would march into North Vietnam, they would enter the war. And they threatened very clearly this would be a global war. At the time when China was actually acquiring nuclear weapons. So it was, to a certain degree, a defensive war. However, given that what we know about the DRV now, particularly about the DRV under Le Duan, about the internal brutality of the North Vietnamese regime, I'm not convinced that resisting this regime was completely dishonorable. Still, this requires to ask us what could have been done differently. One problem is, of course, that the United States did not really understand what this regime was about. It was not a Soviet or Chinese puppet. It might have shared world revolutionary goals with Moscow and Beijing, but Hanoi was its own master. Also, Le Duan's DRV aimed in the long run at Indo-Chinese reunification. So to a certain degree, there's this domino theory there, but the Americans didn't understand what kind of domino there would be. But ultimately, what stopping Vietnamese communist expansion would have required is that the United States would have been required to reach out to China, which is essentially what it does 10 years later, in 78, 79, when unified Vietnam marches into Cambodia. But this is, of course, not possible in the late 1960s, when China is still in the depth of the Cultural Revolution. So timing is not right. So ultimately, probably the United States could have not done much. And ultimately, the intervention, the American intervention, might have led to a further radicalization of the North Vietnamese regime under Le Duan. So it probably was even counterproductive. So finally, let me return to the exhibit. When you leave this room, there is this case with documents, and on this side, actually, there's a fascinating letter which a fourth-year student at McGill of South Vietnamese origin, an English major, has wrote actually to the McGill Daily in October 1967. And he wrote that he neither supported the communists nor the Americans, and that in fact the people in his country, in South Vietnam, were good people who were just actually dedicated to build up a nation, and they gave their best to make this nation work. And he wished that all foreign powers, any of them, would leave the Vietnamese alone to sort out their problems. It is quite a stunning letter, written at the time of great political conflict, even here on McGill's campus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lüthi. Professor Lüthi is a co-host of this event, and you can see that we were thrilled that we were able to convince him to be a speaker. I actually want to introduce Laurie Podolsky, who is an archivist with us and who is responsible for the exhibit that Professor Lüthi has been describing. And so she's going to give you a few details before we get to the question and answer period, because I know you have some burning questions. So Laurie, then we'll go.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Professor Lüthi. What an amazing lecture, and I enjoyed it very much. So as Natalie was saying, tonight's exhibit, The Vietnam War, Activism, Advocacy at McGill University, is arranged to highlight two themes of student activism and faculty advocacy around 1968. The east side of the case highlights the student role with photographs from a February demonstration at the Placement Services Office and a letter to the editor on the Vietnam crisis by the student that Dr. Lüthi was just mentioning. While the west side highlights the faculty involvement with the university's Faculty Committee for Peace in Vietnam, with a petition to U Thant, then Secretary General of the United Nations, and an open letter to Prime Minister Pearson, highlighting their political concerns should Canada ever be invaded in case of a war. The south end of the exhibit highlights graphical concepts to protest the U.S. bombing, the lengthy engagement of soldiers in Vietnam, to the celebration of Tet Vietnam. The last one was organized by the Association of Vietnamese Patriots in Canada, with support from the American Deserters Committee and the McGill Moratorium Committee. The photographs that you'll see tonight as well were taken by a McGill News photographer, Brian M. Smith. And he captures a student protest against companies with economic, industrial, or military ties to the Vietnam War, the companies want to come onto campus and participate in job recruitment fairs. And so they were protesting that. They didn't want those companies on campus. The McGill Daily also captured activism through articles, events, and editorials. The 1967-68 volume that's on display contains white markers to indicate the placement of some of these stories. So you'll see a lot of pieces of white paper sticking out, so you can get a sense of how many students wrote to the McGill Daily and how it was captured. And just to give you an idea, some of the headlines include Vietnamese spokesman described defensive war covering a conference at the Leacock building. And these were three members of the National Liberation Front who came to Sir George Williams University, Concordia, and to McGill. The Canadian anti-war movement, the Yellow Peril and Canadian complicity, change for peace in Vietnam depends on U.S. bombing halt. And of course the list can go on. Faculty members across academic institutions formed a committee to advocate for peace through petitions and letters to the government. In this example, the records document their activities in writing to the federal government and to the United Nations for peaceful resolution, as I mentioned earlier. However, their actions did not stop with the letters. Faculty also reached out to the broader university communities for resources such as accommodation and employment for war resistors. And as an aside, this Monday, February 5th, marks the 50th anniversary of the open letter to Prime Minister Pearson. And that letter was published in the McGill Daily. So it's also very exciting that we're having another anniversary. The photographs, the old McGills, and the McGill Dailies are also available online. And I do hope you enjoy the exhibit. And before I finish, I'd also like to give special acknowledgement to Dr. Lüthi for the opportunity to create the exhibit and be here. Laura Colangelo, Octavian Spott, Melissa Como, Jennifer Garland, and Jacqueline Sundberg for their assistance with the exhibit. As well, I'd also like to thank Natalie Cook, Eve Lapointe, who's not with us today, but I'm sure would like to be here, and Chris Lyons for their support in the exhibit as well. So thank you and enjoy.
Thank you.
Hi all, I'm just going to talk for 3 minutes or so. My name is Layla Parsons and I teach the history of the modern Middle East here at McGill. Lorenz has asked me to say just a few very brief words to try to draw a connection between what was going on in Vietnam in the late 1960s and early 1970s and politics in other parts of the world. So the Middle East is obviously very far from Vietnam, but if you comb through the sources carefully, you can find important lines of connection. The period of the late 1960s and early 1970s saw the height of what was known in Arabic as the Palestinian Revolution. The Palestinian Revolution was the ascendancy of the PLO in Jordan and in Lebanon as a formidable revolutionary organization in the wake of the defeat of the Arab states in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. While the Tet Offensive was going on, the Palestinians were mounting what they saw as their own liberation war, expressed in particular through the Battle of Karame. The Battle of Karame was fought in March 1968, as Tet was still ongoing in Vietnam. It was a battle between the PLO and Israeli forces in the border town of Karame in Jordan. Although a much smaller military event than the Tet Offensive, it was often referred to in Palestinian revolutionary circles of the time as the Palestinian Tet. What is particularly interesting about both the Battle of Karame and the Tet Offensive is that both were defeats from a military point of view, but both were turned into politically symbolic victories by the Viet Cong and the PLO respectively. So Professor Lüthi is currently working on a huge new book. He tells me it's going to be 750 pages when it finally comes out. And this book is a truly global history of the Cold War. And one of the things that the book does is it looks at the history of the Cold War through the lens of South-South relations. As such, he is bringing to light understudied connections between, just for example, the PLO and the Chinese government, connections that have not hitherto been fully explored. Vietnam in particular was important for the Palestinians and other Arab nationalists on the revolutionary left as a model of successful revolutionary warfare. I thought I would just read to you from the transcript of the opening words of a conference on the Vietnam War, convened by leading Palestinian leftist intellectuals in Beirut in early 1973, just a few months after the Paris Peace Accords had brought an end to large-scale American military involvement in Vietnam. So these opening words of this 1973 Palestinian conference that I'm about to read are a window on the global connections and solidarities between anti-imperialist revolutionary movements in the late 1960s and 1970s. And this is translated from the original Arabic. Thus, the Vietnam War has ended, or rather one of its wars. For the people of Vietnam have not known peace for almost 30 years, ever since they took up arms against the Japanese, and then the French, and finally against the Americans and their collaborators during the 50s, and in a more concentrated way ever since the 60s. The people of Vietnam won against the Japanese invasion and also claimed victory against French colonialism during the Great Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a day recorded as a victory against one of the most powerful imperialist forces known to history. This people, the Vietnamese, a miracle. This land, Vietnam, a legend. This specific experience commands respect and requires interest. Vietnam, the experience, is the richest experience presented to us by modern revolutionary heritage in facing different forms of oppression. Insofar as we need to look at our Palestinian past and study our history of struggle, analysing the roots of our reality and analysing this reality with its contradictions and points of weakness, we also need to learn lessons from the momentous experiences of the world's peoples, especially in Vietnam.
Right. I'm sure there are questions. And how much time do we have, Natalie? 20 minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, and we can continue at the buffet. So, yes, please.
Thank you for coming. I have a question, I have a comment. The question is that American predecessor of CIA
Yep.
already involved in Vietnam before the end of the Second World War? That's the question.
Okay.
And the comment is that somebody said that to win the war, you need to win one of the factor of BMW. BMW doesn't mean the car.
Yeah.
B stands for battalion.
Yeah.
M stands for motive or morale. And W stands for weaponry. So the northern Vietnam, they think they have the advantage in the motive or morale. And the weapon, the secret weapon, is the American TV. Do you agree?
Well, first question is the predecessor of the CIA was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, if I remember correctly. And there's an involvement. There are actually a very few officers on the ground between the March coup and the August Revolution in 1945. And one of them actually does write the Declaration of Independence that is read by Ho Chi Minh on September 2nd, or has co-written. Now, the BMW. This is a really difficult question. Of course, North Vietnam was well run. It had a well-developed, top-down actually state. Was very good at mobilizing its resources. Got a lot of resources from China and the Soviet Union, from the socialist world. In the 60s, it becomes also a police state. In fact, East Germany is helping to build up the Ministry of State Security and the apparatus to persecute. So it's a more complex, actually, story. What you also know is that after the Tet Offensive, there is resistance now in the north. There are resistance groups that spring up, and it takes roughly until 1970 for them to be suppressed. And in 1972, the Easter Offensive, so the third attempt, is, in my view, an attempt just to really play the last card. At that time, North Vietnam is so exhausted economically, and its people are actually so tired. I found interesting East German documents describing North Vietnam in March 1972. They say, nobody works in factories. People are so exhausted and so hungry they can only work for 2 or 3 hours per day, and then they go out home and rest. This is a state close to collapse. And I'm not quite sure whether this has something to do with motivation or with weapons. It has something to do with the state mobilizing the last resources and essentially going for broke. And once it is broke, it essentially has to make the compromise. That's my answer. Yes, please.
Hi. What was the extent of communist support in the South, and to what extent did they have very strong networks in the cities among is that, I guess, one of the reasons why Tet failed, is that they didn't really have that strong support base there?
It depends, in the 40s, when it's established, it is a very weak state, and it's probably not very popular at that time. In the 1960s, around Tet, we have to see this in comparison to the Republic of Vietnam, that state is not very popular either. Most of the insurgents were stationed in the countryside. There were probably people in the cities laying low. This is also how the insurgents in the countryside got certain actually things they needed, medication, and so they had contacts in the city. However, what is quite important to see is that in the cities there was some support for the regime. And what went through my mind in the last couple of days is what influence had the Tet Offensive in the United States and what influence had it actually in South Vietnam? And that might be an answer to your question. It breaks Johnson, and then a year after the offensive, the news are coming out about My Lai, about the massacre in March 1968. And My Lai is down here in the Mekong Delta. It's a village where American troops killed between 350 and 500 actually villagers, women, children, and old people. And this one news item really, is really a problem for the American government now, Nixon. What is forgotten is that there's a similar massacre in Hue, which was occupied by the insurgents in February 1968, and 2,800 people are essentially killed by the communists. Some of them were buried alive. When these news broke in South Vietnam, it led to an outpouring of support for the regime, because everybody knew that if the communists come, this is what's going to happen to us. So these are two massacres that are remembered in very different ways, in very different places. But they also speak to one thing, that loyalty to the South Vietnamese state and loyalty to the communist insurgents is a very complex phenomenon which we probably don't understand completely to this very day, because we probably never will, because we don't have the data. There were no opinion polls, and we probably can understand it in a sort of in anecdotal ways at best. Yes, please.
I had a question. You had said after World War II that Roosevelt did not want the French to return to Indochina. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what were his reasons for that.
Well, Roosevelt, I compare him to sort of Wilson 2.0, right? That is sort of a reformed Wilsonian who still had some actually what we would consider now racist ideas, but who completely understood that the colonial empires had to go. How he arrives at this conclusion, that's now debated, whether it was really about just creating a liberal empire for free trade that would actually benefit the Americans, or whether he's really a genuine decolonizer and not going to go there. But he saw the French as a problem. He saw the Brits and the British Empire as a problem. But he distrusted the French more, and this is also related to the very difficult relationship between the Americans and de Gaulle. And de Gaulle, of course, is the leader of Free France, or the emergent Fourth Republic, since the summer of 1944. And it's quite clear to the Americans that de Gaulle wants to get back into possession, actually, of the empire, not only in Indochina, but also actually in Western Africa and in Northern Africa. And in the Levant, of course, and there he is pushed out by Churchill in May 1945. So this is really an imperial power that does not understand that the times have changed, that France is completely discredited because it was overrun by the Germans in 1941. So that's the background of the story.
So how did the French get back in?
In the wake of the Brits. The British move in September 1945, and it's essentially French troops on the ground, commanders that can actually convince the British commanders more or less to agree that they land. They were sent by de Gaulle, and the decision is made by British commanders on the ground and then more or less approved by London in retrospect in September 1945.
So Roosevelt
was dead by then. He died in April 1945. Yes, I have a question back there.
I simply wanted to thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I wish I brought my kids.
Right.
I'm from Saigon.
Yeah.
I brought my mom tonight. We actually left on April 30th, 1975.
Oh.
So we were the whole people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as we were leaving, the tanks were coming in. Anyways, I think what you shared tonight, it's so relevant, and that's why I wish I brought my teenage kids who are born here and who know nothing about this. So I hope you're going to redo this again. And if I have a chance to attend the seminar, Vietnam War, I'd love it. I can share you my war story. So thank you.
Yeah, I just want to mention that I do have actually a friend coming in who is also of Vietnamese ancestry, and her family also left, I think, a couple of days before your family left. So April 30th is when the North Vietnamese army essentially takes the Republican Palace in Saigon. And she is one of the leading historians of North Vietnam. She wrote a very good book. It's called Hanoi's War, and it's particularly on the 60s, and I have drawn a little bit on that book for this talk. Her name is Yen Hang Nguyen. So you will find it easily on Google.
I'm also the Nguyen.
Okay, well, it's frequent, right? Maybe one question or so, or? Okay, last question, yes, please.
There are reports that Johnson was ready to make peace prior to leaving office, but Kissinger wanted Nixon to be the person who made peace with Vietnam. Is that accurate? Is that myth? Is that?
This was big in the news, I think a couple of months ago or last summer, that the news carried this report that Nixon essentially violated American law by contacting North Vietnamese representatives, I think in Paris, and essentially promising a better deal, and that the Johnson administration, they should not negotiate with representatives of the Johnson administration. Now, historians have known this for quite a while, so it was not new to me, and it is correct. And Nixon did violate actually American law. Going back to, I think, the War of 1812, that you're not supposed to have private diplomacy, if I remember correctly.
One last thing.
There was one in as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's just a speculation. If the Americans had never gone to Vietnam, speculate what do you think would have happened?
No, this is a counterfactual. I think South Vietnam probably would have collapsed, but probably this probably would have happened early in the 60s, and Le Duan would have been not so radical. The question is, if that happened earlier, whether Le Duan would have come to power in the first place in the late 50s. That's another question. I think it probably would have looked very differently because there's so much bitterness in 75 on all sides. The more interesting question for me is, what if the French had actually really devolved power in the late 40s, which they didn't. They did it on the surface, but not in reality. I think that really would have made a difference. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we couldn't have had a more eloquent thanks than the statement from the back of the room, but just join me in thanking not only Lorenz, but Leila and Faith as well for participating this evening. When Lorenz and I spoke about this series, how many months ago?
Oh, that was in the spring, I think.
Right, we said we wanted talks that would appeal to a wide variety of people. We wanted to be able to showcase how some of our collections could support not only research, but interesting, curiosity-driven questions. And it's really exciting tonight. First of all, we had a fabulous speaker. We could see that nobody's jumping up. The questions are actually engaging in ideas that you will want to engage with. And I'm also looking around the room and I'm seeing a lot of new faces. So give me a second here. Who has never actually been in this room before? Take a look behind you. This is very interesting. And how many of you are Professor Lorenz graduate or undergraduate students? Okay, it's actually it's a few. How many of you are people from the Center for Lifelong Learning? Just a few. And if you take a look at that, this means that we've got a huge diversity of people, many of whom have never come here before. And that's part of our point. We're a public institution at McGill. This is a resource that's available to the general community as well as to McGill students. Take a look at how few students, a number of them said they'd never been here before. Do come and take a look. We have some fabulous treasures. And part of what these talks do is they prompt us to gather the energy and the wherewithal to actually develop the exhibits. And so Laurie is really to be credited, along with the people she credited, for a huge amount of work to put that together. So as you enjoy your wine and your refreshments, please do take a look at the exhibit, as well as ask all those questions that you didn't have the chance to ask in the question and answer period. Because I know Lorenz is around and Layla's around too, and we're seeing some very knowledgeable people. So huge thanks to everybody. So do grab one of these flyers as on your way out.
I expected this. I haven't seen it because we have